Hello, how are you? I'm great. And you? Excellent, excellent. Yes, today I'd like us to talk about the question of wrongful death and how it is my view and opinion that the governments that allow these millions of workers to die without restoring their right to be members of the human species and the human race basically cause these people's wrongful death. I mean, in the sense that it is a wrongful death to be forced to die without knowing that you are a member of the species that you were born into by nature. And what we saw happen. Right, right. I mean, well, this is my position and it's my instinct, right? I'm not saying that the average person would agree. I mean, I'm not a practicing lawyer, obviously. I mean, you know what I do. You know what I do. I teach kids ABCs and one, two, threes. So I'm not a practicing lawyer, but what I'm trying to say is that there are many different ways that you can look at the harm that was caused to these millions of workers between 1619 and 1865 in the United States and in the British colonies, and of course in other places as well. But my book focuses on these two places, or these two countries, and in my view, these were forms of wrongful deaths, meaning that the government, by giving statutory and apparent authority to third parties to not only divest these workers of their ownership to their own bodies and their labor, but to literally despeciate these people and to say that these people were not even part of the human race. They were non persons, quote unquote. They were chattel and they were property that were owned and that belonged to third parties. And this was done with the statutory and apparent authority of the government. And in my view, having to live in this status and die in this status, to have to die in this status without the government, um, restoring your right to be a part of the species in which you were born by nature. You have, I think, a natural right. Every human being has this natural right to be a part of the species in which they were born. By not revising the record and not restoring the rights affirmatively for all to know and hear, I think the government caused the wrongful death of each of these millions of civilian people who were stripped by fiat of their membership in their own species. I mean, when you consider that even cats and dogs and plants and just, ants and just everything in nature belongs to a species, the notion that, the government allowed third parties to completely just take away just arbitrarily the right of these people to belong to a species, to know that they belong to a species, to be treated like they belong to the human species is an actionable wrong, I believe, and it's a tort because it forced people to die in that false status, the kind of status I think that could and did cause pain and suffering, and that frankly rose to emotional distress. It was like the intentional infliction of emotional distress by the governments and all the other co-conspirators, including the de facto employers, the corporate entities, the shipping companies, the banks, the monarchy, all of the different players who together help to perpetuate this idea that these millions of undefended civilians who had done nothing wrong, but who were attacked and kidnapped and arbitrarily and extrajudicially enslaved, that they were not a part of the human race. I think that was um, an actionable wrong. And I think for their relatives who were left to inherit this and to continue calling themselves descendants of slaves and to never have had the record cleared, for them too to live and die believing that they are descended from non-persons is itself a pain and suffering. And the government's failure to this day, 400 years later, to correct the record such that new generations are told the truth that these human beings were always human beings. They were born human beings. They were always a part of the human race. They were always a part of the human species. They were never non-persons. They were never chattel. They were never the property of anybody else but themselves. They always owned themselves. They were never owned by third parties. The failure of the governments, in my view, to clearly state this affirmatively so that history books and all of the other materials that educate, the new generations and the future ones are clear on this is itself an actionable tort, because it continues into perpetuity to force um, each new generation of the descendants of these workers to themselves die with the falsehood that they are descended from people who were, or they are descended from non-persons. I think that's very much a tortious act by the government. And if you look at, for example, I was working on a, an article for my blog on theywerenotslaves.com. And, one of the things I think I stated in the article was that it is a manifest injustice. And it's a manifest injustice because the evidence exists and is clear that these people were always part of the human race and they were always part of the human species. And even knowing that, the governments have expressed a kind of indifference to the truth. They have not made any attempts, no serious attempts by any existing government that participated in this wrongdoing against millions of innocent, undefended civilian people who just happen to be from the African continent. They have made no attempts to clear this record, to revise the record so that, especially in the case of children, are taught the truth that these were human beings who were wrongfully labeled as slaves, who were wrongfully labeled as non-persons, who were wrongfully labeled as chattel and the property of others, who were wrongfully said to be owned by others other than by themselves. The fact that young children are being taught the opposite, that these people were slaves and that they were owed, etc., is a manifest injustice because the evidence exists that this is not true. It's false, okay? And I believe that it is a negligent breach of the government's duty of care to all inhabitants, all denizens, all citizens, all persons within their jurisdictions, to protect their rights, including their liberty rights, their due process rights, their civil rights, their labor rights, and just their basic right to belong to the human species. It is a form of manifest injustice, and that is itself an actionable tort. But in terms of the history um, of the wrongful death statutes, and why I tie this to the wrongful death statutes. In fact, The various U.S. states have adopted or enacted their own wrongful death statutes, but just about all of them are based on British law, going all the way back to Lord Campbell's Act of 1846, which was later replaced by the UK Fatal Accidents Act in 1976. And basically, those two acts are the basis of wrongful death statutes today. And in those two acts, the British Parliament, by an act of the British Parliament, allowed relatives of people who were, killed by the negligence of others or by the wrongful acts of others to be able to bring a claim for, loss of inheritance rights, loss of income, etc., etc., after the person had already died. So it was important at that time because prior to that, there was no way for relatives to sue or to bring a cause of action after someone had already died. The dead had no rights, basically. But because of this statute, it is my view that the surviving descendants of these workers can today use this kind of reasoning to help them to develop a case if the governments continue to express indifference in terms of the need to compensate and restitute the families and relatives of these undefended civilians whose rights were so egregiously violated to the point that they were even divested of their membership in the human species, which again is, in my view, an actionable tort, um, given that it causes so much emotional distress and pain and suffering that transcends just that generation of people. I mean, it continues to follow their descendants to this very day. I mean, when you look at cases like George Floyd, for example, I mean, there is a sense, for example, that if you're not a part of the human race, you don't belong. If you're a non-person, you are entitled to just, by definition, less or different rights than the rest of society. And we can see today in many different instances that that's very true, that people who look like they are descended from or associated with these millions of workers who were allowed to be categorized as non-persons by the government are still excluded, they're still discriminated, they're still subject to different rules and different rights in society. There's still a sense that not only within themselves that they don't fully belong, but from others in society who treat them like they don't belong, who exclude and discriminate against them as if they don't belong or they don't have the same rights and privileges as everyone else. And it is my view that that correlates to or is perhaps caused by the the government's negligent breach of its duty of care to protect people from the kinds of violations that occurred in this case, especially the most egregious of all is to despeciate people from the species that they were naturally born in by nature and basically just leave them without a species because if you're not a human being, I mean, what is a non-person? I mean, what species is that? I mean, even plants and dogs and cats have a species, as I said.